This is the story of Alaska, the largest and coldest state in America. Less than 160 years ago, this massive territory belonged completely to the Russian Empire. Then, in 1867, Russia sold the entire region to the United States for a tiny price, just $7.2 million. Most people at the time called it a huge mistake, a waste of money for a frozen wilderness. But this video is the story of the hidden truth. This is the story of how and why the powerful Russian Empire became so terrified, so broke, and so desperate that they were forced to give away a piece of their own continent. This is the real story of the biggest land deal in history. The story is divided into 7 chapters, and we hope you love it. Chapter 1. The $7.2 million mistake. The whole thing happened in the middle of the night. It was late on March 30th, 1867. In Washington, D.C., 2 men, 1 Russian and 1 American, were secretly working inside the office of the Secretary of State. The lamps were lit, papers were everywhere, and the 2 nations were about to finalize one of the strangest land deals in history. The Russian representative was in a massive hurry. He and the American Secretary of State, William Seward, were rushing to sign the agreement before the public or the U.S. Congress could find out and stop it. The deal was simple. Russia would sell its massive territory in North America, which they called Russian America, to the United States. To understand the problem, you have to look at what they were buying. This land was huge. It was 1.7 million square kilometers. That's an area bigger than the country of Mexico. It was a place nobody lived in, filled with deep forests, towering mountains, and frozen coastlines. It was a cold, distant wilderness, and the price for this enormous piece of the world was just $7.2 million. Think about that number. When you break it down, it came out to only about 2 cents for every acre of land. It was almost nothing. The price was so low that it seemed like the person selling the land was desperate, and the person buying it was a fool. When the news finally leaked out, the reaction across the United States was explosive. The country had just been through the long and terrible Civil War. Money was tight, and the country was trying to rebuild. So when people heard their government spent millions on this huge, frozen land, they were outraged. Newspapers across the country immediately attacked the deal. They all agreed. The U.S. had been ripped off. They started calling the purchase Seward's Folly, naming it after Secretary of State William Seward. They said he had bought a terrible mistake. They mocked the land, calling it a frozen wasteland, a polar bear garden, and a giant icebox that was completely useless. They drew cartoons showing a shivering Seward standing in the snow next to a few seals. The common belief was that the Russians were smart and sneaky sellers who had tricked a foolish American government into taking a piece of worthless frozen tundra. But the simple truth was hidden behind all the insults. The people were wrong. The story was actually the complete opposite. The Russians were not the clever ones. They were the terrified ones. They weren't making a profit. They were desperately trying to escape a disaster. The sale of Alaska was not an American folly. It was a forced retreat by the Russian Empire. The deal was driven by 2 key problems: a total collapse in the resource that funded the entire Russian colony, and a terrifying military threat that made defending the land impossible. To understand this fear, this panic that drove the Tsar to sell a piece of his continent, we have to go back to a time when this northern land was not a joke, but was seen as the single most valuable place on earth. Chapter 2. The prize. The Fur Gold Rush. The sheer panic that gripped the Russian Empire in 1867, the fear that forced them to sell their continent, was born from a simple obsession that had lasted for centuries. The story of Russia's wealth, power, and massive size was tied to one thing: fur. But not just any fur. The Russian rulers wanted the incredibly dense, incredibly soft fur of the sea otter. In the 1700s, this animal's pelt was not just valuable, it was considered the single most desired luxury item on the entire planet. The sea otter has the densest fur of any animal, with up to 1 million hairs packed into every square inch. This made the pelt so warm and so soft that it became a massive status symbol in the royal courts of Europe and among the wealthy merchants of China. The price was unbelievable. One single high-quality sea otter pelt could be traded for enough money or goods to make a Russian hunter rich for an entire year. The Russian people had a fitting nickname for it. They called it soft gold. For hundreds of years, the Russian Empire had run almost entirely on this soft gold. It was the source of their taxes, the money they used to build their warships, fund their armies, and construct the beautiful, enormous palaces for their czars, their emperors. This hunger for soft gold drove Russia to become the massive country we know today. Russian hunters and traders, known as the Promyshleniki, were relentless. They were tough, often brutal men, backed by the government, and they pushed endlessly eastward across the continent of Asia. Imagine a never-ending line of hunters moving into the unknown. They didn't stop for rivers, mountains, or weather. They conquered every new territory they found in Siberia, forcing the native tribes they met to pay tribute, or taxes, in the form of fur pelts. Their advance was so fast and so ruthless that it became one of the greatest land expansions in human history. But the success of this hunt contained the seeds of its own failure. The Russian traders were too good, and they were too greedy. They hunted every animal they could find: sable, fox, and marten. They killed them so fast that the animal populations in Siberia began to completely collapse. They were running out of the very product that paid for their empire. By the early 1700s, the Russian hunters had pushed all the way across the continent and finally stared out over the vast cold waters of the Pacific Ocean. They had reached the absolute end of the known world, but they faced a terrible crisis. They had conquered an entire continent, and they had nothing left to hunt. The flow of soft gold that funded the entire government was drying up. This economic disaster created a political panic in the capital of St. Petersburg. The powerful Tsar Peter the Great was trying to modernize Russia and turn it into a world power. He could not afford to lose his main source of money. He listened to the rumors from his hunters' rumors of a vast unknown land to the east, across the water, a land that might still be covered in fresh populations of the sea otter. He knew that the only way to save his empire's finances was to take the biggest risk in Russian history. He had to send men across the terrifying ocean to find that rumored new land. This desperation for soft gold is what pushed Russia to the edge of the map and launched the first deadly voyages into the place we now call Alaska. Chapter 3. Bering's Fatal Gamble. The decision to look for the rumored continent across the water was made by Tsar Peter the Great, but he wouldn't live to see the result. His mission was too vast, too difficult, and too far away. The Tsar needed a man who was both fearless and completely loyal. He chose a Danish sea captain named Vitus Bering. Bering was given a huge, almost impossible task: to sail to the very eastern edge of Russia and then launch an expedition across the unknown ocean. This was not a quick boat ride. The Tsar ordered Bering to first cross the entire continent of Eshwal of Siberaj to reach the starting point on the Pacific coast. Imagine the work involved. For years, thousands of Russian workers, soldiers, and laborers were ordered to move all the supplies for the journey. They dragged massive cannons, tons of rope, huge sails, anchors, and enough food for hundreds of men across 10,000 kilometers of wilderness, often using sleds and river rafts. It was a logistical nightmare that took more than 6 years just to get the equipment to the coast. Bering's first attempt to find America was in the late 1720s, and it was a failure. He sailed north, proved that Russia and America were separated by a strait of water which is now named the Bering Strait, but he was unable to find or confirm the existence of the massive, hidden continent. He returned empty-handed, but the Tsar's government was still desperate for fur. So, in 1741, the massive Second Kamchatka expedition was launched, costing a colossal amount of money. It was the largest and most expensive naval expedition of the 18th century, designed not just to find the land, but to map and claim it forever. Bering finally set sail with 2 small ships. His voyage across the fierce, cold Pacific Ocean was a true disaster. The ships were separated almost immediately in a terrible storm. The crew faced starvation, sickness like scurvy, and constant freezing weather. They sailed blindly for weeks, not knowing if the continent existed or if they were sailing toward the edge of the world. Then, in July 1741, the long journey paid off. They spotted the high, jagged peaks of a massive new landmass, the continent of North America. They had found the rumored land, but the land was not welcoming. The cold, brutal wilderness fought back immediately. On the journey back, exhausted and sick, Bering's ship was wrecked on a desolate, isolated island. Bering himself was so ill he could barely move. He died there, buried on the shore of the land he had risked everything to find. The great explorer had paid the ultimate price. Yet, the few survivors who managed to limp back to Russia months later brought with them the proof that changed everything: hundreds of sea otter pelts they had collected on the voyage. When these thick, soft, dark furs were laid out in the capital, their immense value confirmed the rumors. The newly discovered land was unbelievably rich. The government no longer cared about the cost, the deaths, or the terrible risks. The flow of soft gold had been confirmed, and the Russian rush to claim and exploit the new continent began immediately. The most brutal phase of colonization had arrived. Chapter 4. The Empty Wilderness and the Encroaching Rivals. The discovery of the new land was a massive success for the Russian Empire, but the way they controlled it contained the seeds of its destruction. The new colony, Russian America, never had a chance to become stable. It was created only for one purpose: to grab as much soft gold as possible, as fast as possible. The Russian traders, the Promysheleniki, were running the entire colony like a massive, greedy machine. They were not interested in building towns, farming land, or creating a proper society. Their only goal was to kill the sea otter, pack the furs, and ship them back to the capital. They were incredibly cruel to the native people, forcing them to hunt under the threat of violence. The land was being stripped bare of its most precious resource. To try and bring order to this chaos, the Tsar finally created a powerful monopoly company called the Russian-American Company, RAC. This company was put in charge of everything in the colony. It had the power of the government, the military, and the trade, all wrapped into one. They were supposed to manage the hunt and protect the animals, but even this powerful company was too greedy. They killed the sea otters far too quickly, and the animals couldn't reproduce fast enough to survive. The collapse of the fur trade was not slow. It was sudden and total. The resource that had paid for Russia's expansion and its massive palaces was simply gone. By the 1840s, the coastline of Russian America, the place that was once the richest territory in the world, was virtually empty of sea otters. The colony was now completely bankrupt. It had no industries, no farms, and no money flowing back to the Tsar. It was only costing the empire millions to maintain a few scattered, isolated forts. This economic failure was compounded by a terrifying new problem. Powerful rivals were arriving. As the 1850s approached, the British and the Americans were rapidly expanding their presence in the North Pacific. These were not just small trading ships. These were well-armed, powerful ships backed by massive national navies. They began sailing freely into Alaskan waters, ignoring Russia's claims and looking for any resources left. The Russian government looked at the map and saw the truth. Their colony was weak, broke, and stretched thin across a massive coastline. The closest strong Russian military base was thousands of kilometers away. If the powerful British Empire or the expanding United States decided to attack Russian America, Russia had no way and no money to defend it. The land that was once a source of wealth was now an enormous, dangerous liability. The final proof of this danger came during a major conflict that rocked the world. Chapter 5. The Tsar's terrible choice. The danger to Russian America was not just theoretical. It was proven by war. In the 1850s, a massive conflict known as the Crimean War broke out between Russia and an alliance of powerful enemies, including Britain and France. This war was a brutal and humiliating disaster for the Russian Empire. It drained their treasury, killed thousands of soldiers, and exposed their military weakness. During this war, the Tsar and his generals had a terrifying realization. They knew the powerful British Navy, the most dominant fleet in the world, could easily sail straight across the Pacific and simply seize the undefended Russian-American colony. The small forts and handful of soldiers Russia had in Alaska would not last a single day against a proper British attack. The colony was no longer an asset. It was a military death trap waiting to be sprung. Russia knew that if they lost the war, they would lose Alaska for nothing. The threat was so severe that Russia made a quick, fake agreement with the United States. They promised the U.S. that if Britain attacked Alaska, Russia would pretend to sell it to the Americans just to keep it out of British hands. This maneuver was a clear signal to Tsar Alexander II. Russian America was completely indefensible. After the war was finally over, the Tsar was left with a cold, hard fact. They had a bankrupt colony thousands of kilometers away that they could neither afford to run nor protect. It would only be a matter of time before it was seized. To prevent the ultimate humiliation, losing a massive piece of a continent for free, the Tsar made a secret and agonizing decision. He would sell it, and he would sell it to the one country that was not his main enemy, the United States. The Russian envoy, or ambassador, traveled to America and quietly approached the U.S. Secretary of State, a man named William Seward. The Russians were direct. They offered to sell their entire territory for $7.2 million. Seward knew exactly what this meant. He saw past the empty fur stations and the frozen land. He saw the geography. He knew that removing Russia completely from the continent and securing that massive strategic territory was an historic, once-in-a-lifetime bargain. He was eager to close the deal. The final negotiation was conducted in such secrecy that it felt more like a conspiracy. On the evening of Friday, March 29, 1867, the Russian ambassador was hosting guests when he received a message that Seward was ready to sign. The Russian envoy was so terrified that the deal would leak and be ruined that he rushed straight to Seward's house. Seward's assistant mentioned that the paperwork could wait until the next day. The Russian ambassador famously slammed his fist on the table and declared, "We must do it tonight." So, the small group of men worked all night, rushing through the final details of the massive treaty. They had to finish before the sun came up and the newspapers could discover the secret. Finally, in the early morning hours of March 30, 1867, the treaty was signed. The entire transaction had taken place behind locked doors. Russia had unloaded its massive liability, and the U.S. had secured an entire territory. But the real fight was just beginning. When the public finally heard the news, the outrage was explosive, cementing the purchase in history books as the greatest blunder in American history. The Russians believed they had cheated a fool. They had no idea they had just sold one of the richest, most valuable treasures the world had ever seen. Chapter 6. The folly is complete. The secret treaty was signed in the dark, but it could not stay hidden for long. When the news finally reached the public and the U.S. Congress, the outrage was not just a complaint. It was a political firestorm. The American public and most of the politicians simply could not believe what Secretary William Seward had done. They asked, why did he buy this gigantic empty wilderness? The U.S. had just finished a terrible civil war, and the country was focused on rebuilding the South and connecting the coasts with railroads. Spending $7.2 million on a faraway cold land that most Americans couldn't even point to on a map felt like an insult. The most difficult challenge was getting the money. The treaty had to be approved by the Senate, and the money had to be approved by the House of Representatives. For weeks, the halls of Congress were filled with angry arguments. Politicians ridiculed the land, and Seward relentlessly They kept using the name Seward's Folly, and many congressmen simply refused to vote for the funding. They didn't want to be the ones who paid for an icebox or a polar bear garden. The entire deal almost collapsed. Seward and the Russian ambassador had to work behind the scenes, offering quiet deals and favors to lawmakers just to get the votes they needed. After a long, ugly debate, the U.S. Senate finally ratified the treaty, and eventually, the House narrowly approved the funding. The decision was made, but the public remained convinced the government had made a terrible mistake. The final act of the sale took place 6 months later. On October 18, 1867, the official transfer ceremony was held in the small, remote capital of Russian America, Sitka. Imagine the scene. It was a cold, gray day. The small Russian garrison and the handful of American soldiers stood lined up on the muddy parade grounds. A handful of local residents and native Alaskan people watched silently. The huge Russian flag, the symbol of an empire that had controlled this land for 126 years, was slowly lowered from the flagpole. The ceremony was simple, quiet, and deeply awkward. The old empire was officially handing over its huge northern territory. Once the Russian flag was down, the new American flag was hoisted up. For the first time, the massive U.S. flag, with its 37 stars, flew over the North Pole of the continent. The land now belonged to the United States. For the American soldiers and officials who were there, the feeling was one of total isolation. They were in a cold, distant land that seemed worthless. The Russian officers, meanwhile, sailed away with their $7.2 million, convinced they had just made a fantastic escape from a bankrupt and indefensible colony. For years after the purchase, the public criticism seemed correct. The U.S. government mostly ignored Alaska. It was simply too expensive and too far away to care about. The critics enjoyed their victory, saying, "See, we told you it was a waste." But what none of them knew, not the angry congressmen, not the mocking newspaper writers, and certainly not the escaping Russians, was that the true, staggering wealth of this frozen wasteland was hidden, just waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The sleeping giant was about to wake up. Chapter 7. The sleeping giant wakes. After the transfer ceremony in 1867, the American purchase of Alaska remained a punchline. For decades, the critics who had screamed about Seward's Folly seemed completely right. The massive land sat mostly empty, thousands of kilometers from the American capital. The U.S. government treated it like a frozen backyard, maintaining only a handful of military posts and trading stations. The entire territory became known as Seward's Icebox, with no sign of ever producing the wealth the American government had hoped for. But history has a long memory, and the land was merely waiting. The whole narrative of the foolish buyer and the clever seller was about to be turned upside down by a single, incredible discovery. In 1896, nearly 30 years after the sale, the news flashed around the world. Gold had been found in massive quantities in the nearby Klondike region of Canada, right next to the Alaskan border. The discovery immediately sparked the legendary Klondike Gold Rush. Suddenly, the frozen wasteland wasn't worthless anymore. It became the only gateway to instant wealth. Thousands of desperate, hopeful people poured into Alaska. They sailed up the coast, hiked over mountain passes, and flooded the territory. The small port towns became crowded, chaotic centers of excitement and crime. The gold rush didn't just bring money. It forced the U.S. government to pay attention to its distant territory. The gold rush was only the beginning. It proved that Alaska was not a barren land, but a resource giant hiding its riches. As years went by and the territory was explored more deeply, prospectors and scientists kept finding more and more valuable resources. The dense forests provided endless timber. The cold waters held some of the richest fisheries in the world, filled with salmon and cod. But the final, most astounding discovery was made decades later. Beneath the frozen ground, Alaska was sitting on some of the largest, most valuable reserves of oil and natural gas in the entire world. The wealth pulled out of Alaska's ground, since the purchase is impossible to fully count, but it is certainly worth trillions of dollars. The initial cost of $7.2 million is now just a tiny, meaningless fraction of the fortune the U.S. gained. And beyond the money, there was the geography. When the Russians sold the land, they were thinking about fur. But Alaska's location, sitting right between North America and Asia, proved to be one of the most vital strategic points on the globe. During the World Wars and the Cold War that followed, Alaska became a massive, powerful shield, protecting the entire continent of North America. The sale of Alaska proved two things. First, Secretary William Seward did not commit a folly. He made the single most valuable real estate purchase in American history. Second, the Russian Empire did not escape a liability. They sold an unbelievable treasure out of panic and desperation, permanently giving up a strategic foothold on a continent that would have shaped the course of the 20th century. Chapter 8. The final irony. The story of the Alaska purchase is a perfect example of how panic and short-term vision can lead to historical disaster. We can now look back at the entire sequence of events and see the incredible irony that was completely missed by everyone involved. In 1867, the Russians were so completely focused on the immediate threat, the bankruptcy of their colony due to the vanished soft gold. and the terrifying risk of losing the land to the British for free that they completely misjudged the future. Their mindset was one of pure desperation. They looked at the huge frozen territory and saw only a massive expense and a military target. They rushed to sign the treaty, collected their $7.2 million, and sincerely believed they had made a clever escape from an impossible situation. Meanwhile, the Americans, led by Secretary William Seward, were thinking bigger. While they bought the land for a strategic foothold on the Pacific, they were also widely mocked for purchasing a useless icebox. But the land's true value, the gold, the oil, the timber, and the massive fishing resources, was simply lying in wait, patiently hidden beneath the surface, until the right time. The price they paid, which seemed so high at the time, was truly one of the greatest bargains in human history. The greatest consequence of the sale, however, was not about money at all. It was about power and geography. When Russia sold Alaska, they weren't just selling a piece of land. They were permanently removing themselves from the North American continent. They gave up a massive strategic position that sits right across the top of the globe. Today, Alaska is one of the most important pieces of land for American defense and power, sitting right next to Russia's eastern border. It acts as an immense shield and a constant, powerful American advantage. The biggest folly ever bought by the United States turned out to be the smartest gamble they ever made, securing massive wealth and a vital military advantage for centuries. And the sale, born out of the Russian Empire's panic and desperation, is why the Russian flag has never flown over North America again. The lesson of Alaska is simple. History doesn't care about what people think is valuable in the moment. It only cares about what the land itself is hiding. We really hope you enjoyed the documentary. If you did, consider subscribing to support the channel. Bye for now, and catch you later.